You serve drinks. Mississippi leave legacy to people who own it. Ethan Caldwell didn't raise his voice when he said it, but somehow that made the words cut deeper. The rooftop ballroom of the Seabrook Grand went quiet in the subtle way expensive places do, where embarrassment never announces itself out loud. Crystal glasses still chimed. A pianist still played somewhere near the windows. Beyond the floor-to-ceiling glass, the Atlantic rolled black and silver under a moonlit sky. But for one suspended second, every server, investor, and executive in the room felt the same thing. The young waitress standing beside the founder's table had just been put in her place. Claire Bennett lowered her eyes to the tray in her hands. Not in surrender, not in shame, just in control. "Of course, Mr. Caldwell," she said softly, as if he had merely asked for more ice in his bourbon. Then she stepped back with the kind of grace that made powerful men think they had won. Ethan barely looked at her again. At 38, he had built a reputation from Boston to Palm Beach as the man who could walk into a dying luxury property and turn it into a gold mine in under 18 months. Historic inns, coastal resorts, forgotten city landmarks. He bought them, polished them, renamed them, and sold them for numbers that made headlines. Tonight was supposed to be simple. The Seabrook Grand, a 100-year-old oceanfront hotel with fading grandeur and old money bones, was about to become his next acquisition. By midnight, the papers would be signed. By next quarter, the place would be transformed into another Caldwell flagship. In Ethan's mind, that was the only story that mattered. Claire moved silently between tables, collecting empty champagne flutes and folded linen napkins, but the hotel felt different to her than it did to everyone else in the room. To the guests, it was a glamorous relic. To the investors, it was a distressed asset with ocean views and upside potential. To Claire, it was memory wrapped in mahogany and brass. She knew which banister groaned in humid weather. She knew the exact place where the late afternoon sun hit the east staircase in September. She knew that the portrait near the ballroom entrance was hanging half an inch too low, and that the chandelier above the dance floor had once been shipped in pieces from Vienna in 1928. No one had told her those things. She simply knew. A busser brushed past her with a tray of mini crab cakes, nearly clipping the carved walnut chair at the head of the founder's table. Claire caught the chair before it scraped. Her fingers lingered for half a second on the polished wood. It was old, hand-finished, original. "Careful," she murmured. "That one matters." The busser blinked at her. "It's just a chair." Claire gave a small smile. That's what people always say right before they ruin something. Across the room, Ethan stood beside the hotel's general manager and two attorneys, one hand in his pocket, the other resting on a crystal tumbler. Navy suit, white shirt, silver tie, a Swiss watch that caught the ballroom light each time he moved. He looked exactly like the kind of man who belonged in a room full of seven-figure decisions. And when he laughed at a private joke from one of the investors, people leaned in instinctively, as if success itself had a gravitational pull. But even from 30 feet away, Claire noticed what most people missed. He never looked at the hotel. Not really. He looked at margins, at signatures, at leverage. He looked at the ballroom the same way a man might look at an empty lot with good zoning. That was why, when one of the junior associates asked where the closing packet should be placed, Claire answered before she meant to. "Not on that table," she said quietly. "The lacquer warps under warm lights. The original seal can bleed if the room gets too hot." The associate froze. The attorney frowned. And Ethan turned, finally seeing her again, not as background, but as interruption. His gaze moved from her black server uniform to the tray in her hands to the name tag pinned above her heart. Claire. Just Claire. Nothing about her looked extraordinary. Blonde hair pinned back neatly. Clear blue eyes. Calm posture. A woman most people would dismiss in less than 3 seconds. Ethan's mouth curved in the faintest hint of amusement. "Interesting," he said, taking a slow sip of bourbon. "Since when do waitresses comment on acquisition documents?" A few people chuckled. Quietly. Politely. The way people laugh when they want to stay on the side of power. Claire held his gaze for one brief, impossible second. There was no anger in her face. No humiliation. Only something steadier. Something older. "Only when the building deserves better," she said. Then she turned and walked away before anyone could decide whether she had just made a mistake or a promise. Claire did not look back. but she felt the shift behind her the way sailors feel weather before the clouds move in. In a room full of polished shoes and practiced smiles, Ethan Caldwell had finally noticed her, and that was rarely a simple thing. She crossed the ballroom floor with steady hands, setting down fresh, sparkling water at table 12, replacing a folded napkin at table 6, nodding politely when a woman in pearls asked for lemon with her iced tea. Her face remained composed. Her breathing stayed even. But beneath the black server jacket, her pulse had changed. Not from fear, from timing. Near the west windows, the ocean pressed itself against the dark shore in long silver bands. The wind made the glass hum softly, almost like a voice trapped inside old walls. Claire had heard that sound since she was 8 years old, standing barefoot in this very hotel while her grandfather explained that buildings were like people. If you listened long enough, they told you what they had survived. She remembered his hand resting on the brass railing, his deep New England voice, the scent of cedar and coffee in the air. This place is not just brick and books, Claire Bear. It is a promise, and promises do not belong to the highest bidder. She had been too young then to understand what inheritance really meant. Now she understood it too well. Across the room, Ethan accepted a leather portfolio from one of the attorneys. Daniel Mercer, lead counsel, trim gray suit, gold-rimmed glasses, the kind of man who made every sentence sound expensive. Beside him stood Vivian Ross, the hotel's general manager, elegant in a cream-sheath dress, smile polished to perfection. Vivian had been running the Seabrook Grand for 3 years, and in that time she had learned to speak about layoffs as if they were efficiency upgrades and about staff cuts as if they were weather. Claire knew that voice. She had heard it in the break room, in budget meetings, in the careful lies told to housekeepers working double shifts without overtime. Tonight, Vivian looked radiant. She believed the deal was already done. We are ready for signatures as soon as the final authorization page is confirmed, Mercer said. One remaining ownership acknowledgement, but the trust language should cover us. Ethan swirled the ice in his glass once. Should, he repeated. He did not raise his voice, but Mercer immediately straightened. The beneficiary has never appeared in person, Mercer clarified. The ownership interest is controlled through a family trust. It is unusual, but not impossible. We have every reason to expect compliance. Every reason. Claire nearly smiled at that. She passed by with a tray of champagne flutes just as Vivian glanced toward the service station. Claire, Vivian called, too brightly. The Caldwell table needs another bottle of the reserve Cabernet. And please try not to hover near the closing documents this time. A few people nearby smiled. Not kindly. Claire stopped. Turned. Of course, she said. Then, after the smallest pause, would you like the 2016 Napa or the 2018 from Sonoma? Vivian blinked. The 2018. Claire tilted her head slightly. Mr. Caldwell requested the 2016 when he arrived. He said the 2018 was over-oaked. For the first time that evening, Ethan's attention shifted fully back to her. He had said that, quietly, more than an hour ago, in passing, to no one important, and yet she had remembered. Bring the 2016, he said, eyes narrowing. And Miss Bennet? Claire met his gaze. Yes, sir. How exactly do you know so much about this place? The ballroom seemed to lean inward. Claire let the question hang just long enough to matter. Then she answered with a softness that landed harder than defiance. Some people study a place before they decide what it is worth. Ethan stared at her as she turned and walked toward the cellar staircase, the old brass key hidden in her apron pocket pressing lightly against her hip like a heartbeat from another life. Upstairs, the investors kept smiling. The pianist kept playing. But somewhere beneath the music and the crystal and the sea, the truth had already entered the room. The cellar stairs creaked under Claire's feet in the same places they always had. 3rd step from the top, 7th from the landing. Then the soft hollow sound near the bottom where the floorboards had been replaced after a winter flood nearly 20 years ago. She carried the bottle of 2016 Napa Reserve in one hand and let the other brush lightly against the stone wall as she descended, not because she needed balance, but because some habits felt like prayer. The lower level of the Seabrook Grand smelled of oak, old cork, and sea salt that had somehow found its way into every hidden corner of the building over the decades. Down here, away from the music and polished laughter upstairs, the hotel was honest. No chandeliers. No investment pitch. Just age. Just memory. Just truth. Claire stepped into the private reserve room and paused. The cabinet door near the back was slightly open. It should not have been. Her eyes narrowed. She set the wine bottle on a side table and crossed the room in 3 quiet steps. Inside the cabinet, behind rows of Bordeaux and Napa labels, was a recessed panel hidden in the original woodwork. The panel had been shut when she checked it that afternoon. Now it was not. Just half an inch. Enough to tell her someone had been curious. Or careless. She slid her fingers into the narrow seam and opened it. Inside sat a flat leather folio wrapped in cream linen, protected from dust and temperature by the old cedar-lined compartment her grandfather had once shown her, with a conspiratorial smile. Not everything important belongs in a safe, he had told her. Sometimes the safest place is where greedy men do not bother to look. The folio was still there. Thank God. But the linen wrap had been shifted. Not much. Just enough to confirm what she had already suspected. Someone had found the compartment. They just had not understood what mattered yet. Claire exhaled slowly and retied the linen with careful fingers. Inside that folio were copies of the original deed, trust amendments, handwritten notes from her grandfather, and one sealed letter she had never opened because he had marked it with 6 simple words in fountain pen. When they underestimate you, wait. Upstairs, the gala swelled toward its final act. Down here, the hotel offered her one last warning. She slipped the folio into the deep inner pocket of her service bag and closed the panel. Then she stood still, listening. Footsteps. Faint. Above her. Moving across the ballroom floor. She could not hear words, but she knew the rhythm of urgency when she heard it. Something had changed. By the time Claire climbed back to the ballroom, the energy had sharpened. Investors clustered in tighter circles. Mercer was speaking more quickly than before, one hand pressed against the closing packet. Vivian's smile had thinned around the edges, and Ethan Caldwell was no longer relaxed. He stood near the founder's table with the stillness of a man who had stopped enjoying the room. He took the wine bottle from Claire when she approached, not because he intended to pour it himself, but because he wanted an excuse to keep her there. You disappeared, he said quietly. The cellar is downstairs, Claire replied. That is usually where the wine is. His jaw shifted, just slightly. He was not used to being answered without apology. Mercer says the final authorization page is delayed, Ethan said. Funny timing. Claire set a clean crystal glass beside him. Buildings tend to resist being sold when the wrong people rush them. It was a strange sentence. Too strange to ignore. Ethan looked at her more carefully now, as if trying to fit the woman in front of him into a category that made sense. But Claire Bennett did not fit cleanly into any category he understood. Her uniform was pressed, but old. Her voice was gentle, but precise. Her eyes did not flinch from his. And beneath all of it was something else, something that unsettled him in ways he could not explain. Familiarity. Not with him. With the hotel. As if she belonged to the walls more than the management did. Tell me something, he said, lowering his voice as Mercer and Vivian argued in hushed tones nearby. If you know this place so well, why are you carrying trays instead of sitting at the table? Claire reached for the bottle, uncorked it with smooth, practiced ease, and poured 2 inches of dark red into his glass. The wine caught the chandelier light like garnet. Then she looked at him, calm as the ocean beyond the windows. Because the people who belong at the table are not always the ones standing closest to it, she said. Before Ethan could answer, Mercer turned sharply, face pale beneath the ballroom lights. Mr. Caldwell, he said, we have a problem. And for the first time that night, the man who believed everything could be bought felt the faint, unfamiliar edge of uncertainty. The room did not erupt. Wealthy rooms almost never did. They tightened. They chilled. They smiled less. Daniel Mercer stepped closer to Ethan Caldwell and lowered his voice, but not enough to keep the tension from spreading through the ballroom like perfume in warm air. The authorization page is missing, he said. Not delayed. Missing. Ethan set his glass down with deliberate care. Define missing. Mercer swallowed. The final trust acknowledgement was in the closing folio when we arrived. It is not there now. Around them, investors kept pretending to mingle. A woman in diamonds laughed too, brightly, near the windows. The pianist drifted into another soft jazz standard. A waiter crossed the room with crab cakes no one was suddenly interested in. But every eye within 20 feet had sharpened. Claire stood half a step back from Ethan's shoulder, holding the wine bottle, expression unreadable. Vivian Ross moved in quickly, polished and composed, though the pulse in her neck betrayed her. "This is a simple clerical issue," she said. "I will have staff search the office immediately." "Staff?" Ethan repeated, turning toward her with that cold, controlled precision that had made more than one executive regret underestimating him. "You want the people serving canapés to search for a missing legal document that determines whether this hotel changes hands tonight." Vivian's smile flickered. "No, of course not. I simply mean," "You mean," Ethan said, cutting across her, "that the one page I need has disappeared inside the building you were paid to prepare for sale." Silence. Smooth. Heavy. Expensive. Claire did not move, but she saw it now with painful clarity. Ethan Caldwell was not rattled because of the money. Men like him did not fear losing a deal. They feared losing control. Mercer adjusted his glasses and opened the leather closing packet again, flipping through thick cream pages, embossed tabs, trust schedules, title reports, tax disclosures. His fingers slowed, then stopped. "There is something else," he said. Ethan turned sharply. "What now?" Mercer hesitated just long enough to make the answer worse. "The trust schedule references an original deed attachment that should have been included in the packet for verification. It was not requested because we assumed the beneficiary would not appear in person. But without the authorization page, the deed becomes more important." Ethan stared at him. "And where is the deed?" Mercer's voice dropped. "According to the file index, the original deed is still on property, in secured archival custody." Claire looked down at the label on the bottle in her hand, so no one would see the change in her eyes. Not fear. Not surprise. Confirmation. Vivian stepped in too fast. "That cannot be correct. The archive inventory was transferred years ago." Mercer frowned. "Then why is there a handwritten notation in the trust amendment from 6 months ago stating, 'Original deed retained in Founder Archive, Seabrook Grand, per beneficiary instruction'?" The words landed like a match in dry paper. Ethan turned slowly toward Vivian. "Beneficiary instruction?" he asked. "You told me the trust was passive." "It is," Vivian said quickly, "meaning the beneficiary does not actively manage operations. That does not mean there have never been communications. And you failed to mention that." Ethan's voice stayed level. Somehow that made it worse. Claire watched Vivian carefully. The general manager had always been good under pressure. Tonight, for the first time, she looked almost human. "I did not believe it was relevant," Vivian said. "The beneficiary has never once stepped forward publicly." "No," Claire said softly. The single word was so quiet that only the people closest to her heard it. Ethan turned. Mercer turned. Vivian turned fastest of all. Claire set the wine bottle down on the edge of the founder's table. Her hands were still. Her voice remained polite, almost gentle. "She just never stepped forward where you were looking." Vivian's face drained of color so quickly it was almost elegant. Mercer blinked. Ethan stared at Claire as if he had heard a language he did not yet understand, but suddenly needed to. Across the ballroom, the ocean wind pressed against the tall windows with a low, steady hum. Somewhere above them, the chandelier light trembled against crystal. And in that strange, suspended moment, Claire reached into the pocket of her service apron, wrapped her fingers around the old brass key, and realized the night had finally arrived. Claire looked at Ethan Caldwell, then at Daniel Mercer, then finally at Vivian Ross, who stood beneath the chandelier light with the brittle stillness of someone realizing that years of careful control could collapse in a single sentence. The ballroom had not stopped moving, but it no longer felt like a party. It felt like a stage where everyone had suddenly remembered the floor might not be solid. Claire slipped the old brass key from her apron pocket and held it between two fingers. It was small, worn smooth with age, the engraved S on its head nearly faded from decades of use. Not decorative, not symbolic, real. "Founder Archive," she said softly. "Third level below the wine reserve. East wall. Cedar cabinet behind the reserve ledger." Mercer stared at the key as if it had materialized out of thin air. "How do you know that?" Claire's eyes moved to him, calm and almost kind. "Because I am the one who instructed it to remain on property." The words did not need force. They carried their own. Ethan did not blink. Vivian did. Once. Too quickly. "That is absurd," Vivian said, her polished voice suddenly too sharp for the room. This woman is a server. She has worked under me for months. She is not authorized to access restricted archives. Claire tilted her head slightly, and for the first time that night, there was the faintest trace of sadness in her expression, as if she had hoped Vivian would choose silence over humiliation. No, Claire said. You were never authorized to lock them. Mercer looked from Claire to Vivian to Ethan. Mr. Caldwell, if there is even a chance she is telling the truth, we need to verify immediately. Ethan's gaze stayed on Claire. There was no arrogance in it now. No smirk. Only calculation fighting with disbelief. Come with me, he said. Vivian stepped forward. Absolutely not. We cannot allow an employee to interfere in a confidential legal review. Ethan did not turn toward her. You lost the right to tell me what this evening allows when my closing documents went missing under your supervision. Then, finally, he looked at Claire. You have one chance, Miss Bennett. If this is some kind of stunt, it is not, Claire said, and something in the simplicity of her answer made him stop. She did not sound nervous. She did not sound triumphant. She sounded tired, like a woman who had spent too long waiting for a room full of strangers to catch up to the truth. Mercer motioned to one of the junior associates to secure the closing packet and keep the investors occupied. Vivian began protesting again, but Ethan cut her off with a look so cold it silenced her instantly. Then he took the brass key from Claire's hand. Their fingers brushed for half a second. Her skin was cool, steady, human, not the kind of hand he associated with inheritance, not manicured for boardrooms or protected from labor. A waitress's hand, he thought automatically. Then he hated himself for thinking it. They crossed the ballroom together, Ethan, Mercer, and Claire, while the pianist kept playing and the investors pretended not to watch. At the service staircase, Claire moved ahead without hesitation. Down one flight, then another, past the wine reserve, past the old service corridor with framed black and white photographs of the hotel in its first years. She knew every turn, every hidden latch, every scar in the wood. Ethan noticed it all now, each quiet certainty rewriting what he thought he understood. At the bottom of the third level, Claire stopped before an unmarked cedar cabinet built flush into the wall. She looked at Ethan, not challenging him, not pleading, simply waiting. He slid the brass key into the hidden lock. It turned smoothly, too smoothly. The cabinet opened with a soft click, revealing a recessed compartment, and, inside it, a cream linen-wrapped folio resting on cedar shelves like something the building itself had been protecting. Mercer inhaled sharply. Ethan stared at the folio, then at Claire, and for the first time in years, the man who had built an empire on certainty felt the ground shift beneath him. Open it, Claire said quietly. And this time, read the name before you decide what a person is worth. Ethan Caldwell did not move for a full second. The cedar cabinet stood open before him, the hidden compartment exposed, and in the center of it rested the linen-wrapped folio like a heartbeat pulled from the walls of the Seabrook Grand. Daniel Mercer stepped closer first, almost reverent now, as if the legal documents he had treated like routine paperwork had suddenly become something sacred. Claire remained just behind them, one hand lightly resting against the old stone wall, her face unreadable in the soft amber light of the service corridor. She was not enjoying this. That was what unsettled Ethan most. If their positions had been reversed, most people would have savored the humiliation. Claire Bennett did not look vindicated. She looked finished with waiting. Ethan reached into the compartment and lifted the folio carefully. It was heavier than it looked, bound in dark leather beneath the cream wrap, edges worn smooth by time. He untied the linen cord and opened it. The first page was a notarized trust amendment. The second was a property map of the original hotel footprint, hand-inked, with the Atlantic shoreline marked in fading blue. Then came the deed. Thick archival paper, raised seal, original signatures. Mercer leaned in, reading with the quick, trained precision of a man whose career depended on details. Then he stopped, his breath caught in a small, involuntary sound that echoed louder than it should have in the narrow corridor. Ethan looked down. There, beneath the legal description of the land, beneath the original ownership transfer, beneath the trust language that had carried the property through 3 generations, was the beneficiary line. He read it once, then again. Claire Elizabeth Bennett. The words did not change. His hand tightened on the edge of the page. For a moment, the corridor seemed to lose all sound. No ocean, No piano above them. No footsteps. Just the brutal stillness of certainty collapsing. He turned his head slowly toward Claire. Her name tag was still pinned to the black fabric of her uniform. Claire Bennett. He had seen it all evening. Had barely registered it. Had reduced it to a convenience. A label. A detail on someone who brought him wine. And now that same name sat embossed into the legal spine of the entire building. This is authentic, Mercer whispered, his voice almost shaken. Original deed, valid chain of title, active trust structure. There is no question. She is the controlling beneficiary. Ethan looked at Claire, and the memory struck him with humiliating precision. You serve drinks. Mississippi leave legacy to people who own it. The sentence replayed in his mind, now unbearable in its arrogance. Claire did not rescue him from it. She simply met his gaze and let him sit inside the truth of what he had said. How long? He asked at last, his voice lower than before. How long have you known? Claire folded her hands in front of her apron. Since I was 21. And you have been working here as a server for how long? 8 months. Mercer looked up sharply. 8 months. Claire nodded once. Long enough to learn who saw the Seabrook Grand as a home. Long enough to learn who saw it as inventory. Long enough to see who smiled at the staff in public and cut their hours in private. The last sentence was not aimed at Ethan. It was aimed higher, toward the ballroom, toward the woman who had been waiting upstairs in silk and polished lies. Ethan exhaled slowly, the kind of breath a man takes when he realizes the numbers were never the real story. You let this proceed, he said. You let us get all the way to closing. Claire's eyes softened, but only slightly. No, she said. I let the truth reveal itself. Mercer carefully lifted another document from the folio and froze again. Mr. Caldwell, he said, voice tightening. There is more. He handed Ethan a sealed envelope, already slit open on one side. The handwriting on the front was old, elegant, unmistakably personal. For Claire. If they ever try to take it from you. Ethan looked at the open seal, then at Claire. You opened it. Claire's expression shifted for the first time that night. Not guilt. Grief. Tonight, she said softly. For the first time. And suddenly Ethan understood. This had never been about a surprise reveal. It had been about inheritance, yes, but not just of property. Of memory. Of duty. Of a promise buried beneath cedar and stone, waiting for the exact moment the wrong people believed they had already won. Claire took the letter from Ethan's hand with a care that made the gesture feel intimate in the oldest, safest sense of the word, not between two people, but between a granddaughter and the memory she had spent years trying not to lose. The envelope was cream, the paper thick and slightly yellowed, the kind of stationery no one used anymore unless they believed words should last longer than convenience. Her grandfather's handwriting slanted across the page in deep blue ink, steady even near the end. She unfolded it slowly. Mercer stood silent. Ethan said nothing. Even in the dim service corridor, they both understood that some truths were not meant to be rushed. Claire read the first lines to herself, and for one brief second the composure she had carried all night flickered. Her throat tightened. Her lashes lowered. When she spoke, her voice remained clear, but softer than before, as if she were borrowing his strength to finish what he had started. If you are reading this, she said, then someone has already mistaken ownership for power. The words settled into the stone walls like they had been waiting there all along. Ethan did not shift. Claire continued. The Seabrook Grand was never meant to be sold to the richest man in the room. It was meant to be entrusted to the person who still notices when the lamps are dim, when the staff are tired, when the ocean wind finds the east windows before a storm. Claire stopped. A small breath. Then she looked up, not at Ethan, but past him, toward the ballroom above them, where the music still drifted faintly through the floorboards. He wrote that before he died, she said. 3 weeks before. Mercer glanced at the deed, then at the trust amendment, then at Claire. Miss Bennett, he said carefully, the respect in his voice no longer performative. This trust structure gives you complete authority over transfer, retention, or restructuring. No sale can proceed without your direct written consent. None. Ethan absorbed the sentence in silence. Not because he did not understand it, because he understood it perfectly. Every hour of negotiation, every polished promise, every assumption, meaningless without the woman he had dismissed in under 10 seconds. Claire folded the letter and slid it gently back into the envelope. Then she drew one more document from the folio and handed it to Mercer. He read the top line, and the color left his face. "This is a compensation audit," he said. 12 months of payroll records. Internal notes. Schedule changes. Off-ledger adjustments. Claire nodded. "Prepared by me. Verified against archived time cards, manager directives, and accounting exports from the old back office terminal Vivian assumed no one still knew how to access." Ethan looked sharply at her. "You audited your own hotel while serving tables?" "No," Claire said. "I served tables while learning who had been stealing from it." The sentence hit harder than anger would have. Mercer flipped through the pages, his legal mind catching up to what his instincts already knew. "There are wage discrepancies here," he said. "Missing overtime, misclassified staff hours, vendor inflation, unauthorized consulting disbursements." Claire's eyes hardened, but only around the edges. "And a management bonus tied to occupancy projections that were artificially inflated before tonight's sale." Ethan's gaze went flat. Dangerous now, but not toward her. "Vivian," he said, almost to himself. Claire did not answer. She did not need to. The evidence already had. For the first time that night, Ethan saw the larger shape of the truth. He had not been the villain of the story, but he had been arrogant enough to become useful to one. Someone inside the hotel had intended to rush the sale, bury the records, cash out, and leave the staff to absorb the damage. And he, with all his intelligence and polished instincts, had walked straight into the trap because he believed numbers on paper mattered more than the people carrying trays around them. "Why did you not stop it sooner?" he asked quietly. Claire met his eyes. "Because I needed to know who would reveal themselves when they thought I was powerless." There was no accusation in the words. That made them worse. Ethan looked at the deed again. Claire Elizabeth Bennett. Then at the black uniform. Then at the old brass key still resting in her palm. He had come to buy a building. Instead, he had been brought face to face with a woman who had inherited not just property, but patience. And patience, he was beginning to realize, was the most expensive form of power he had ever encountered. When they returned to the ballroom, the music was still playing, but now it sounded absurdly distant, like a memory of elegance in a room that had already changed. The chandeliers still glittered. Champagne still caught the light in crystal stems. The Atlantic still moved beyond the windows in slow silver bands. But whatever illusion had held the evening together was gone. Ethan Caldwell walked first, Daniel Mercer at his side, Claire just behind them carrying no tray now, no bottle, no borrowed roll. Only the cream folio in her hands and the old brass key resting against her palm like a final punctuation mark. Conversations thinned as they crossed the floor. Investors turned. Assistants straightened. Servers paused near the walls. Vivian Ross, still standing near the founder's table, recovered her posture the moment she saw them. It was almost impressive. "Mr. Caldwell," she said with practiced concern, "I trust this unnecessary detour is resolved." Ethan did not answer immediately. He stepped past her and placed the folio on the table where the closing packet had been waiting all night. The sound was soft. Final. Then he turned to Mercer. "Tell them." Mercer removed his glasses, wiped them once with a folded handkerchief, and spoke in the clipped, precise cadence of a man who understood that every syllable now carried legal weight. "The sale is suspended effective immediately. The trust beneficiary has been identified, verified, and is present on property. No transfer can proceed without her direct written authorization. Furthermore, newly reviewed documents raise material concerns regarding payroll compliance, fiduciary disclosure, and management conduct that require immediate internal review." Silence spread outward in widening rings. One investor set down his drink. Another quietly took a step back. A woman near the windows whispered, "Who is the beneficiary?" Mercer did not answer her. He looked at Claire instead. Ethan did too. The entire room followed. Claire stood still for one beat, letting the truth arrive before she did. Then she stepped forward. No dramatic flourish. No raised voice. Just one measured step out of the service shadows and into the center of the room her family had built long before anyone in it had learned how to price legacy by the square foot. "My name," she said, "is Claire Elizabeth Bennett." Her voice was gentle enough that people had to listen. "And the Seabrook Grand does not belong to a board, a management team, or the highest bidder. It belongs to the trust established by my grandfather. I am the controlling beneficiary." The words landed harder than a shout ever could. Vivian's face remained composed for exactly 2 seconds. Then the mask cracked. "That is impossible," she said. "You cannot expect anyone here to believe that a waitress." Claire looked at her, and Vivian stopped speaking. It was not intimidation. It was worse. It was certainty. "A waitress," Claire repeated softly. That was never the problem. She placed a second set of documents beside the folio, neatly aligned. Payroll audits, compensation records, internal approvals. The evidence she had spent 8 months collecting while carrying trays through rooms full of people who never looked twice. "The problem," she said, "is that while you were busy deciding who mattered, you assumed no one below your eye line could read a ledger." A low murmur moved through the ballroom. Vivian reached for the documents, but Mercer intercepted them first. He scanned the first pages, then looked up with unmistakable alarm. "These records indicate unauthorized compensation shifts, inflated vendor invoices, and withheld overtime tied to managerial bonuses," he said. "This is serious." Ethan's expression went cold in a way the room had not yet seen tonight. Not performative, not social, surgical. "Vivian," he said, "did you think burying labor violations inside a legacy property sale would survive due diligence?" Vivian's breath caught. "You do not understand. These were temporary adjustments. Market conditions. Staffing realities. Everyone in this industry does it." "Not in my company," Ethan said. Then, after one cutting beat, and apparently not in hers, he turned to Claire. The entire ballroom watched the exchange as if the ocean itself had gone still. "Miss Bennett," he said, and for the first time that night the title sounded like respect instead of dismissal. "The deal is yours to end." Claire looked at the founder's portrait on the far wall, then at the servers near the doors, still in black uniforms, still holding trays, still standing straighter than they had an hour ago. Then she looked back at Ethan. "No," she said quietly. "Not end." The room leaned in. Change. No one in the ballroom moved. It was as if the entire Seabrook Grand had taken a single breath and decided not to release it. Claire Bennett stood at the head of the founder's table in her black server uniform, one hand resting lightly on the cream folio, the other at her side, calm in a room full of people who had built their lives on appearing impossible to shake. Ethan Caldwell watched her with the stillness of a man who had spent decades controlling outcomes and was now witnessing something rarer than power. "Restraint. Change," Claire repeated, her voice quiet enough to make every person in the room lean closer. "This hotel is not a trophy. It is not a distressed asset. And it is not a place where the people who keep it alive are treated as disposable." She turned to Mercer. "As of tonight, I am suspending all transfer activity pending a full internal audit and independent review of payroll, vendor contracts, and executive compensation." Mercer gave a single respectful nod. "Under your authority as controlling beneficiary, that can be done immediately." Claire looked toward the servers standing near the ballroom doors, still frozen with trays in their hands. And for the first time that evening something warm touched her expression. "Effective tonight, all unpaid overtime identified in the audit will be restored with interest. Every employee whose hours were manipulated to protect management bonuses will be made whole." A sharp intake of breath came from the service line. One of the housekeepers near the corridor covered her mouth with trembling fingers. Vivian Ross found her voice again, but now it sounded thin. "You cannot make emotional decisions in front of investors and call it governance." Claire turned toward her slowly. "No," she said. "Emotional decisions are what happen when someone sees a building and forgets the people inside it. This is accountability." Then she looked at Ethan. The room looked with her. The silence between them felt different now. No longer adversarial. Not yet trust. But something had shifted. Something honest. Ethan held her gaze for a long moment, then set his glass down untouched. "If you are asking whether I will challenge your authority," he said, "I will not." The investors exchanged quick glances. That sentence, from a man like Ethan Caldwell, was worth more than the contracts on the table. He stepped forward, not to reclaim the room, but to yield it properly. "For the record," he said, his voice carrying now, smooth and unflinching, "Caldwell Hospitality withdraws all immediate purchase claims and supports Miss Bennett's right to review, restructure, and determine the future of the Seabrook Grand under her own terms." Claire studied him. Why? It was a simple question, but everyone heard what lived underneath it. Why would a man like you surrender a deal? Why would a man who measures everything in margins accept being corrected in public? Ethan did not look away. Because I came here to buy a hotel, he said. And instead, I was forced to see what I should have noticed the moment I walked in. He glanced at the black uniform, the brass key, the founder's portrait, then back to her face. You were never just serving this place. You were protecting it. The words settled over the room like a second kind of verdict. Claire could have humiliated him then. She could have repeated his own sentence back to him. She could have let the room enjoy the reversal. But that was never her way. I did not hide who I was, Mr. Caldwell, she said softly. You just did not think someone like me could be standing in plain sight. The sentence was gentle. It left no room to escape. Ethan gave the smallest nod, the kind a man gives when truth has stripped him down to the only response that matters. That is fair, he said. Then, after a beat that made the whole ballroom hold still again, for what it is worth, I was wrong. No spin, no charm, no performance, just 5 words, and somehow they sounded heavier than all the contracts on the table. Claire looked at him for one long second. Then she reached for the closing packet, removed the signature page, and set it aside. Not torn, not destroyed, simply removed from the path it had been rushing toward. The Seabrook Grand will remain open, she said, under new leadership, under old values. And if there is ever a partnership here, it will be with someone who understands the difference between value and price. Ethan almost smiled, but not quite. Then if you ever decide to consider one, he said quietly, I hope I earn the right to be asked. Around them, the tension finally broke. Not with applause. This was not that kind of ending. It broke in smaller, truer ways. A server straightened her shoulders. A bellman exhaled. The pianist, somehow sensing the room had become something else, shifted into a softer melody. Outside, the Atlantic wind pressed against the windows and moved on. Claire picked up the old brass key and closed her fingers around it. Her grandfather's letter rested beside the deed. The founder's portrait watched from the far wall. And for the first time in years, the Seabrook Grand no longer felt like something she was trying to save alone. As the investors began quietly leaving and Vivian stood in the center of her own unraveling, Claire turned toward the ballroom doors, ready to speak with the staff before anyone else. Ethan stepped aside to let her pass. This time, he did not make the mistake of standing in her way. She paused only once, just long enough to look back at him, and when she spoke, her voice was soft enough that only he could hear it. You should not have recognized the owner, she said. You should have respected the waitress. Then she walked on, and Ethan Caldwell stood beneath a century of crystal light, watching the woman he had underestimated restore an entire building without raising her voice, understanding at last that the quiet ones do not prove their worth when the room is ready. They simply wait until the truth is.